So in the next 40 minutes, we are so lucky to be able to welcome the host of Slow Burn Season 7. Her name is Susan Matthews, and she is coming directly from New York. This season, Season 7, that was aired last year, is about Roe against Wade and the forgotten history of abortion in the US. Very actual and very interesting story. And it was released last year, the same period of time, where the abortion laws was changed in US. And this season, Slow Burn Season 7, has won the Apple Award for Best Podcast of the Year and the Ambi Award for Best History Podcast. And just before Susan Matthews, she come on stage, I was told to play this little video just to get in the mood for Slow Burn Season 7.
Winner of Apple Podcasts Show of the Year. Don't miss this important season of our critically acclaimed series, Slow Burn. Now is the time to revisit this pivotal moment in history, exploring the lead up to Roe v. Wade. Meet the women who fought for legal abortion, the movement that formed to push back, and hear about the rookie Supreme Court justice who got assigned the opinion of a lifetime. Listen to Slow Burn Season 7 now on Apple Podcasts. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. We're going to get to that in 1 second. So I wanted to start by explaining two things. One is what the show Slow Burn tries to do, and the other is a little bit about the federal court system in the United States. So we're going to start with the easy one, which is what Slow Burn tries to do. So Slow Burn is a history podcast, and Slate launched it in 2017. And we launched it because Donald Trump had just been elected president of the United States, and everyone was talking about impeachment, but nothing was quite happening yet about impeachment. So we decided to look back in time to the last time that everyone in America was living with that kind of uncertainty, and the first season is about Watergate and the Nixon impeachment. Ever since then, my season is the 7th season, so we've done a few other seasons. We did one on the Clinton impeachment that actually ended up coming out right during Me Too and the LA riots, which was also very timely. So one of the things that we always think about when we're making a slow burn is what is the thing that's going to be relevant when this season is airing? And it's a little bit of a tricky thing to figure out with the timing. But I started thinking about Roe v. Wade actually back in 2017 because one of the things that's amazing about Slow Burn is that it explains something that people know about, but they don't necessarily know everything about in great detail. And I felt like I know what Roe v. Wade is, but I'm not sure I know the full story. But then I really started thinking about it in earnest in September of 2020. And this is where we have to get into a little bit of an explanation of the American court system. So what happened in September of 2020 is that one of the justices on the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, died. And Roe v. Wade, for anyone who doesn't know, is the Supreme Court case that guaranteed the right to abortion in the United States. It was established in 1973. And abortion is very controversial in the United States. And so for the next 5 decades, since 1973, when Roe was established, the anti-abortion groups were very much targeting the Supreme Court. And they thought that if they could kind of take power of the Supreme Court, they could overturn Roe and accomplish their goal. And really, I think that it's kind of an explanation of how we got Trump in the first place, because Trump promised to appoint justices who would rule against Roe v. Wade, even though it was established precedent. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies, and Trump is still president, and we could do a whole other series of Slow Burn about like all of these machinations in Congress about what is happening with the Supreme Court, but suffice it to say, Trump appoints a woman, Amy Coney Barrett, to the court. And this is really the moment for me when I realized that that appointment of Amy Coney Barrett was basically the decision of Roe v. Wade getting overturned being made. That decision is when conservatives really take over this strong majority in the court. So in September of 2020 is when I really got a lot more serious about pitching this season and researching it. And so we decided to do it. And by that summer, we knew that the court was going to hear a case called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health that following year. And so one of the reasons why I know all of this, like not everybody in the US was fully expecting all of this to happen, but in my normal job at Slate, I cover jurisprudence and I cover the Supreme Court. So we're all watching this really, really closely, and we kind of have this knowledge of the schedule. So we know that Dobbs is going to be heard in December, and we know that the decision is going to come out in June. So I start working on this series in October of 2021. We aired our show in June of 2022, and 2 days after our last episode came out, Dobbs came down and overturned Roe v. Wade. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the show. One of the things that Slow Burn aims to do is we really want to bring people back to the time period and not just like relay information about history. What we really want to do is tell people what it felt like to live through these important critical moments that have then affected us for the rest of our history. So the first thing that I did when I was making this series is that I decided to narrow the focus. I decided to narrow it to 1970 to 1973. And these are 3 critical years for abortion politics in the US. A lot of things are being debated. And one thing that I think is really interesting about this period is that in those 3 years, nobody in America knows that Roe v. Wade is going to be the case that decides it all. So Jane Roe is at the Supreme Court and her case is being argued, but nobody knows that she's the one that's going to decide it. Instead, if you're living between 1970 and 1973 in the US, the person whose name you would know that you would associate with abortion is Shirley Wheeler. These are clips of Shirley Wheeler. We're going to hear a little clip from the show to hear what is happening with her.
Shirley Wheeler wasn't a pseudonym on a legal docket. She was a real person, someone the whole abortion rights movement could rally around.
What we do here from this weekend on is going to make a critical difference as far as what happens to Shirley. We are responsible for keeping her out of jail. We are responsible for Shirley's freedom. And we're also responsible for our own freedom. And that's what we've got to fight about.
This is Slow Burn Season 7, Roe v. Wade. I'm Susan Matthews. This season, we'll be looking at the years leading up to one of the most important Supreme Court rulings in history. How did abortion become such a divisive issue in American life? Why were the politics back then so dramatically different than they are now? And was it ever really possible for the courts to find a solution? But first, how one unlikely woman, for a brief moment, became the public face of the fight for abortion rights.
I don't claim to know everything about legalizing abortion, but I am proof of what will happen to you if you have an illegal one.
In 1970, when abortion was still against the law in most states, Shirley Wheeler, like so many other women, got one anyway.
So I really wanted to start with Shirley's story because her story is so everyday. I eventually got into all the legal stuff and like what actually happened in the case Roe against Wade. But for today, I'm mainly going to talk about the women whose stories make this series. So Shirley Wheeler is thought to be the first woman to be charged with manslaughter for getting an abortion. You can see the news clips here. They think I'm a murderess. Like any good journalist, when I started pitching this series, the first thing that I wanted to do was read the entire Wikipedia page for Roe v. Wade, and I did, and I saw a reference to Shirley Wheeler on it. And then I started doing my real research and buying books and reading those and everything like that, and I couldn't find anything about her almost anywhere. She was someone whose story was in the newspapers and in the New York Times and being talked about on 60 Minutes, but she's not really remembered in the history books. And so I want to take a second to admit that I was not an audio person before I started working on this series. I was an editor, like I said. And so I had done all this research and I was working on it and I was really dedicated to doing Shirley's story as our first episode. And my editors on this show came in and they were like, well, what tape do you have? And I was like, I don't know, I don't really have, we have an academic, we have a couple things. And they were like, you have 1 week, go get tape from somebody who knew Shirley Wheeler personally. You need that if she's going to be the first episode of your series. So me and my producers really took that seriously. We really doubled down, and we started finding people who were still alive who had known Shirley. Shirley herself passed away in 2013. But we were able to find someone who served as her lawyer. And not only were we able to find somebody who served as her lawyer, that lawyer still had letters from Shirley Wheeler. That's the letter that you see there, Dear Miss Stearns, that's written by Shirley Wheeler. We found a local reporter who had interviewed Shirley, and we found Shirley's boyfriend from the time. And his name was Robert Wheeler, and there are a zillion Robert Wheelers in the state of Florida. And we were trying to find him, and there were just too many. And my producer knew that this guy had been kind of an artist in the 1970s. There was some reference to the fact that he had done taxidermy. And she finally Googled Robert Wheeler taxidermy, and his website came up, and we saw a photo of him, and we were like, could that be this person 50 years later? And it was. So, why did Shirley get an abortion? Shirley had health problems. She had one early pregnancy, and she actually gave that child to her brother to raise. She was very young, 17, when she had her son. And after she had that pregnancy, her doctor told her that she could not go through that again, that it would be really, really dangerous to her health. So she actually ended up having 2 illegal abortions, but she only got in trouble for the second. And she got in trouble because she was bleeding, and she went to the hospital. And we think that somebody at the hospital told the cops that she must have had an abortion. So when she goes home to her house, the police come to her door, and they're asking her who performed the abortion. Before Roe, the people who were prosecuted did not tend to be the women themselves. They prosecuted the doctors, which is one of the reasons why Shirley's case is so unusual. The way that abortion worked often before Roe, when it was illegal, because the doctors were at such high risk, is that you would basically set up your abortion and you would wait on a street corner, and a car would come and pick you up, and you would be blindfolded and taken to get the procedure, and then put back in the car and dropped off where you were. And so women often didn't even know who the person was who was performing this procedure. So the cops asked Shirley who did this, and she refuses to tell. And that might be because she didn't know herself, but it's also kind of a political stance, I think, that she takes. And you can tell that. One of the things that I was so grateful for when I found these letters is that I could really tell who Shirley was. So Shirley is accused of manslaughter. She has a full trial, and the jury finds her guilty. And this is the part of the story that really grabbed me and was this is how I know that this has to be the first episode. The judge gets to decide her sentence. And he could have sent her to jail for 2 years, but instead, he gives her a different kind of punishment. he tells her that she either has to marry her boyfriend at the time, she's 23 years old, or she has to go home to North Carolina to live with her family. A real punishment. This really happened. So this is the point where Shirley becomes kind of a rallying cry for the abortion rights movement. And what she actually decides is she decides that she's going to go home to North Carolina, but she's also swept up by this movement. And there are all these women who start supporting her. And one of the reasons why Shirley is such a good person for them to be supporting is because up until this point, one thing that women told me again and again and again is that at abortion rallies, they would chant the names of women who had died getting illegal abortions. And one of the reasons that they were so grateful for Shirley is that she had survived her ordeal and she could be there still. At the end of the last clip that we played, you hear a little tiny bit of tape of Shirley at a rally giving a speech saying, "I don't suppose to know everything about abortion access." That was one of the only little bits of tape of Shirley's voice that we had. But that tape where she gives that speech, it's actually the first rally she's ever been to about anything, and it's about her. So these are some photos of Shirley that her boyfriend Robert Wheeler gave us, and I think that just shows Shirley as who she was a little bit more. We're going to listen to one more part from the end of episode 1 that's about what I think Shirley's story means.
Shirley Wheeler's story helped fuel the fight for abortion rights in America. Now, hardly anyone remembers her name. I think that's because her story isn't the type we normally celebrate. Shirley didn't want to be a mother. She gave up her only child, and she had more than one abortion. But the women chanting Shirley's name in 1971 didn't think Shirley had anything to be ashamed of. They believed every woman deserved the right to control her own body. And they knew there were Shirley Wheelers everywhere. What do you hope people who are hearing about Shirley's story for the first time, what do you hope they take away from it?
That it could happen today. That it is happening today.
The last person that you hear in that clip is Nancy Stearns, who ends up actually being Nancy's lawyer at the end, or Shirley's lawyer at the end. She's the one who Shirley was writing the letters to. And a year after Shirley was convicted, Florida actually changed its laws about abortion, and so Nancy helped get her sentence overturned. And Nancy is still alive, and she came into our studio and we got to meet her and talk to her. And it was pretty intense because we were doing this in the lead up to Dobbs, and Nancy is also a close court watcher, so she knew that where things were going. So, I knew when I started this reporting that I was going to have to look at both sides. I don't think it's a secret, I've already said, abortion politics are very, very divisive in America. One thing that I really wanted to do in this series was I wanted to seriously engage with the other side on this issue. It's a little bit complicated. I think it's one of the most interesting journalism questions about this series. I work at Slate, we're an opinion magazine, and I was on the record saying that I support abortion access before I even started working on this. But it was really important to me to bring in the other perspective and to try to figure out a way to do that would be illuminating to the issue in some fashion. So this was actually easier for me than I initially thought that it was going to be, because back in the early 1970s, abortion politics are like totally scrambled. They're totally different than they are now. And in fact, it's Republicans who basically support changing the laws and liberalizing access to abortion because they're like into small government. And it's Democrats who have the largest number of people who don't support abortion access. And the reason for that is because opposition to abortion at this time largely comes from Catholics And Catholics are largely working-class Democrats. So Catholics believe that life starts at conception. That's why they oppose abortion. And this is a photo of the Handbook on Abortion. It was published in 1971. That's the front, that's the back of the cover. On the back of the cover, you see a photo of the authors, who are Dr. Jack Wilkie and Barbara Wilkie. And they're a married couple. They're Catholic sex educators, actually, at the beginning, before they turn into anti-abortion activists. They have this whole thing where they go around talking about the beauty of monogamous sex made to create children. So you can see the through line. And he's actually an OBGYN, and she's a nurse. And they're kind of approached by a few different people, including their church, and they're convinced to write this book that's the Handbook on Abortion. And what it does is it basically tries to refute every argument that there is for abortion access. The book is kind of written in a question and answer format. It's a really intense document to go through. It says things like, it's impossible for a woman to get pregnant from rape because she has to enjoy sex to conceive. So it's a lot of stuff like they're doctors, but it is not scientifically accurate, obviously. And so this book has been expanded for decades since it was first published, and it's really, really popular in conservative circles now. The biggest thing that the Wilkies figure out is how to rally their side about this cause, and they do this through photos, and we're going to listen to a little bit, and the man that you hear talking in this clip is Jack Wilkie.
In the early 1970s, the Wilkies figured out something else, that images of aborted fetuses could be just as powerful as ones in the womb. Early editions of the Handbook on Abortion included full-color photographs of abortions performed at 4 different stages. Each one has a simple caption explaining the procedure: by scraping, by suction, hysterectomy at 24 weeks, salt poisoning at 20 weeks.
More and more people who were opposed to abortion began sending them more and more photographs, and everybody understood that if you wanted to get more people on board, you showed the pictures.
These images became the centerpiece of the Wilkies' presentations to Right to Life groups.
Here is what your feet looked like when you were only 10 weeks in your mother's womb.
So the thing that I found the most interesting about the Wilkies is the way that I had grown up actually seeing a lot of things that I think come from the Handbook on Abortion, even though I didn't know about the Handbook on Abortion until I started doing this research. So in particular, some of these myths about the science and the facts of abortion all come from the handbook. And in particular, it's kind of that graphic imagery, that graphic fetal imagery, that is just such a hallmark of the anti-abortion movement. In the United States, we have like billboards of these kinds of images kind of all over the place. It's pretty intense. So I knew that I wanted to tell their story, and they also were both dead. This is a problem with history podcasts, obviously. But I found their daughter, and I asked her if I could interview her about her parents' influence. And I was kind of surprised that she said yes, but I did a call with her before we set up to record. And then I figured out, like, my favorite fact that I learned in a live interview. I had this book for like months at this point, and in our interview, their daughter Marie tells me that is Marie on the cover. That's her. Her dad convinced her to pose for their cover as a woman who was a girl, really, who needed an abortion, and then that's Jack Wilkie posing as the doctor on the other side. So one more story that I just want to tell as we wrap up here is that I felt that after working on the Shirley Wheeler story, one thing that I realized that I thought was really important is that I hadn't gotten her firsthand account of what it was like to have an illegal abortion. So I really wanted to include that in the series. And this photo is a woman named Anne Hill. This photo was taken by our tape syncer after we did the interview with her. She was in California. And Anne Hill was in her first few weeks of law school when she realized that she was pregnant. And she knew that she didn't want to have a child at that time. She had just started law school. And she went to a doctor in the state that she lived in, which was Connecticut, and she asked for an abortion. And it was 1968, and he told her, no, I can't give you an abortion, that's illegal. So she traveled to New York City, and she got an abortion from kind of an infamous abortionist, that's what they were referred to at the time. And we're going to hear her explain what happened.
I was put completely out, unconscious. When I woke up, I did not know how long the procedure had been. I had no idea if I had been there 10 minutes or 10 hours. I came to in that room eventually and didn't feel the pain immediately. And Dr. Rappaport at that point brought out these papers.
Those papers had nothing to do with Anne's procedure. They were articles and documents about Rappaport's legal troubles.
And he went over it like page by page with me as I was still coming to about how he had been unjustly punished.
It was there, still in stirrups, that Anne learned that Rappaport had been arrested in connection to a woman's death.
Another woman had died, and that stark reality hit me like a punch in the gut.
So Anne is becoming a lawyer, and what she decides to do is organize a group of women in the state of Connecticut to sue the Connecticut government for the right to abortion. And what she does, her strategy, is incredibly interesting. I started this mentioning a little bit about the case Roe v. Wade. Jane Roe is an actual woman. She was anonymous at the time, but she was just one single woman who had to kind of she didn't put her name on that, but she had to kind of stand up and decide, I'm just going to be the sole plaintiff here in this case. Anne organizes hundreds of women to be the plaintiffs in this case. And the case is called Abley versus Markle. That's like a technical name like Roe v. Wade. But the women themselves call it Women versus Connecticut, which was just a fact that I loved so much. And Anne told me that one of her jobs was that she kept the list of all the women. And it was 1971 at that point, and so she's using a typewriter to do this. So every time a new woman signs up, she has to like retype a whole bunch of the list. But she's like, it was so much work, but I loved it because every time I knew that more and more people were joining us. So Anne and the Women versus Connecticut actually win their case, and it happens right before Roe v. Wade. And their case is cited in Roe v. Wade, and it's one of the only, I think it's actually the only case where it's using actual testimony from women about abortion that's cited in the final opinion. So, like I said, this show came out in June, right when we were waiting for Dobbs to come down. And the main thing that I was thinking about when I was making it was, what is life going to be like after we lose Roe v. Wade? And so I just wanted to end with one final clip of the show that's about that.
As I reported this show over the past 6 months, I asked nearly all the women I spoke with the same thing. I have a question because I'm 32 years old. I've grown up with Roe v. Wade and birth control and all of these things just being available. But I've been reading a lot about this period, and I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what it was like for women like me who have not had to really experience that in our lives personally.
Being able to control your reproductive life means being able to control your life. And not being able to control your reproductive life meant you could be excluded from most parts of what was then a male-controlled society.
The shame, the danger of going to people who were unskilled, the risk that it gave to our lives, the darkness of it all.
I was hearing these stories in the early 70s, and some of those stories therefore went back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I remember thinking, I want to do something to make sure that no woman ever has to tell a story like this again.
Making abortion illegal doesn't make it go away. What it does is determine what kind of abortions happen and whether women will be punished for them. That's one of the lessons of Shirley Wheeler's story. So there's a way in which the right to abortion is about practicalities. If the abortions women get are safe or dangerous, criminal or legal. But the women I spoke with, the women who fought for this right, they also understood that they could not be equal without it. That it wasn't about a backup plan or the vague notion of security. It was about knowing and truly believing that their lives had value.
I wanted every woman and girl to have the full human experience without fear of being relegated to a particular stereotype, a particular role that society had for girls and women.
Okay, before we take your questions, we just have one little last thing to share, which is that I'm not hosting the next season of Slow Burn. A familiar person is, but we are sticking with the court, and I just want to share a little trailer for that.
The hearing will come to order. Good morning, Judge. Welcome to the blinding lights.
Coming soon from Slate Podcast.
Members of this committee have asked, who is the real Clarence Thomas?
What is the real Clarence Thomas?
Which is the real Clarence Thomas? I don't know that I would call myself an enigma. I'm just Clarence Thomas.
Slow Burn, Season 8, Becoming Justice Thomas, hosted by me, Joel Anderson. Coming this May, wherever you listen.
Amazing testimony there. Wow, very, very moving. We're going to ask you to have your questions ready in a second. So if you have got a question, please get it ready. Before we do that, Karen, you want to ask Susan a couple of things. So get those questions ready. Over you go, Susan.
First, thank you, Susan. It was really interesting. And one thing is, when I listen to the show, it's so balanced. I mean, the both sides, you actually sympathize with them, you understand why they do, and I read somewhere that that was very important to you, to actually understand the pro-life movement as well. So how are you now? What did that change, talking to those girls?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Even that term pro-life, in the United States, it's actually pretty controversial to use that term now. People like, even the Associated Press style book says that we should say anti-abortion. But one thing I learned when researching the show, which actually made me understand the whole concept more, is that in the late 1960s, there was kind of this entire political movement that was organized specifically around this concept of opposing the death penalty, opposing the Vietnam War, opposing abortion, and they labeled themselves as pro-life, and like it made coherent sense, like that was what they were. And I think that in the 5 decades since, there has been so much specific, targeted kind of manipulation of this entire situation to take this as a political tool. Nixon is kind of the first person who realizes this, but there are many voters in the US who are single-issue voters, and they only vote on the issue of abortion, which is how I mentioned earlier, like Donald Trump's politics don't align with a very religious perspective, but he's put into the office because of this single thing. So that was just something that I learned that really did help me empathize with both sides. Like right now in America, it's tough because you see this as such a political thing, but looking back to that period, and I think the Wilkies defined themselves as pro-life for that reason, really helped me understand it as a deeply held belief.
Okay. Fantastic, thank you. Right, audience, who would like to ask a question? If you'd like to ask, please put your hand in the air and we'll get a microphone to you. So who would like to go first? You're very quiet. I know this is almost the end before the final session. We've got one question over here. Thank you very much. Please say who you are and where you're from.
I think so, yeah. Hi, I'm Ella. I'm from News UK, from The Times. I was just wondering how, of course, it's such a complicated issue with so many facets to it when speaking about Roe v. Wade, and of course you're trying to get that across to an audience that is perhaps younger and, as you said, have lived in a time where birth control's already been available for them. How do you make such complicated laws accessible in an audio format when trying to simplify them but still obviously assume that they do have some prior knowledge?
Yeah, well, this is where I think my background as a legal editor at Slate has really helped me. So I edit to writers who are actually lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer myself. So most of my day job involves helping figure out what these lawyers are saying and translating it into something that will be comprehensible for our readers. And actually really close to the end of making the 4th episode, I realized that it was still a little bit too much. And obviously when you're making audio, you as the narrator, you don't want to have too much of your voice. And so I actually just pulled in one of those lawyers. Her name is Dahlia Lithwick. She's a close friend, and I edit her. And I was just kind of like, Dahlia, we need to talk about this so that you can explain it, and then we can have your voice in it explaining it too. So it was kind of a audio technique and a writer-editor relationship leveraged, I would say.
Okay, thank you. There's a lady here in the white.
Hello, Karen Martin from the BBC. Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. I just wanted to get a sense of how long it took you, because it looks like a lot of work in a good way. And so what was the kind of lead-in time, and did you record the whole thing in one go and then release it, or how did the process actually work?
Yeah, so I kind of knew in advance that I was going to be doing this, and so I did a little bit of background reading, and I was just kind of preparing and thinking through the outline. I started working on it in earnest in October of 2021, and at that point I was working on it with one producer, and starting in February of 2022, our entire team came on, so it's a 5-person team, and we worked on it, kind of 3 of us worked on it full-time, and 2 of those people are editors. We worked on it from February of 2022 until it came out in June. And as far as the logistics, we release it on a weekly basis. So we released 1 episode a week in every week in June, because that's when the Supreme Court is releasing their hearings. We knew, because Roe and Dobbs are such a big deal, we knew it would be later in June, but it was still a guess. We didn't actually know what day Dobbs was going to come out. And as it turned out, we aired our last episode on a Wednesday. On Thursday, we had a live show. And then on Friday morning at 10 a.m. is when Dobbs came out. Wow.
Okay, thank you. That's really instructive. Who else? Who's next? There's someone over here. It's the late gentleman here, and someone else in black. Can't quite see. There we go. Lady there in the black. Thank you very much. And that'll probably be it, I think, unless there's anyone else with a burning question.
Firstly, congratulations for the content. Amazing. How many do you have an average of the streams that you get per season?
Per season, Katie, my PR person is here. She would have to tell you, the show has been downloaded over 100 million times. So it is pretty big. And we knew that we had that audience, which was part of the pressure and the intensity. But find Katie after. She's in a yellow blazer.
Amazing. Thank you. Gentleman here next.
Hi, Adam Shepherd, editor of PodPod. I just was wondering how being named as Apple's best show of 2022 affected the podcast, and whether or not you saw any kind of listener bumps from that or any other kind of effects.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a boost. I think it allowed the podcast to reach more listeners, but the most important thing to me about that was I just noted exactly the timeline, that Wednesday to Friday situation of then Dobbs came down, and after Dobbs, our story was over, but then all of a sudden, all of this reporting and everything that we had done was happening in real time, in the United States. So one of the things that the Apple Podcast collaboration allowed me to do was I kind of got to go back to a couple of sources, and my favorite instance of this is that I actually got to connect Nancy Stearns, who was Shirley Wheeler's lawyer, and Ann Hill, whose abortion story you heard, and we had a conversation together about what they felt had happened since Dobbs, and they were two women who obviously argued and fought for the right to abortion in the first place, so that was a pretty special moment, and they knew each other in the 1970s, and they hadn't connected until we connected them on Zoom. Ann was still in California, Nancy was in New York, just this past November in our studio.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay, one last one there, and then I'll ask Karen if you can make some final comments to sum us up, and then I think we'll be done. So over to you, sir.
My name is Marie-Paul.
Lady, sorry. Beg your pardon.
I'm coming from Montreal. I'm working for a newspaper, national newspaper called Le Devoir, and we also have a podcast, a daily podcast. And my question is, what was your thinking regarding the style? Because in the narration, you are saying, me, hi, but what about the format and the style and the kind of a sound atmosphere you were trying to create it?
Yeah, like I said, came from the writing side, so I was incredibly lucky to work with two just unbelievably skilled producers who helped make it sound like it sounds. One of our producers focuses specifically on finding archival tape, and I think that the archival tape really brings you back to the time. But the other thing that I'll say that was quite extraordinary that we got to do is under a lot of what you heard, even just today, you can hear our theme music, which was composed for us by Alexis Quadrado, who's amazing, and he kind of came in and talked to us about the time period, and we actually created a playlist of songs that we thought evoked the moment, and he gave us a couple of options, and so that theme music, I think, also is really dramatic and important and very evocative of the early 1970s.
Okay, so Susan, just to wrap this up, I saw last night, I think on Twitter, that you shared an article of how it actually is today in US after this change of overturn.
Yeah, it's complicated and messy, and there's a lot going on. Some states have really restrictive laws now. Some states have a lot of, still have access. There's a lot of complication about even if women can go from a state with restriction to a state without, or with access, whichever ways make sense there. But the article I think that you are referring to, so again, I'm an editor in my day job, and I edited a piece by a woman who's a reporter in Texas, and the thing that she found, Texas has some of the most restrictive abortion laws currently, and she interviewed and talked to a lot of doctors and nurses about the fact that it's not just elective abortions that are affected by Roe being gone, it's all kinds of basic health care that is affected. And so what she found is that there are doctors and nurses who are quitting their jobs and leaving the state because they just can't handle not being able to properly care for their patients.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. Let's give a big hand to Susan Matthews.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Susan. Amazing. Our last session is going to be in here. It'll be 30 ideas in 45 minutes. We go straight into our final session then, which is where we're going to be next year. So you've got about 10 minutes or so for a quick cup of coffee, stretch your legs. Please be back here at 2:45 for our final session and then our finale. Thank you very much.